Hey guys, what's up? It's Jamie. In this video we're going to be covering the Ion grid, and we're going to be doing a bunch of examples, and I'm going to be explaining the ins and outs of the Ion grid. By the end of this video you're going to be a master of the Ion grid, so watch to the end and you won't be disappointed. Oh, also if you're completely new to Ionic, then be sure to check out my Ionic installation guide, which just covers basic setup and so forth. Otherwise, we're going to be diving straight into the content and learning about the Ion grid. To get started here, we're just going to scroll down in the docs and grab this most basic example. It's a good starting point for what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to go inside of my blank project and paste in this Ion grid instead of the Ion content, and then just make sure it's aligned properly. And then I'm just going to add another row just so we can have a bigger example to work with. And then on my site, inspecting, we can see that the entire Ion grid is taking up 100% of the width of its parent, and there are two columns, and each row in each column is taking up a third of the page. So by default, the number of columns evenly spans the entire width of the parent, and so if I make the first row only have two columns, 1 of 2 and 2 of 2, then the top row will only have two columns like this. I'm going to add a background color to all the Ion columns so that we can see better how they're appearing on the page. Okay, there we go, and notice that the background is including the padding. So there is padding between the columns, but the background color is just kind of filling that padding. And also the entire page has padding as well. If we wanted to get rid of that, that's just on the Ion content right here. We can just delete that padding attribute. Oh, also the Ion grid has padding itself. If we want to remove that, we can just go inside the SCSS on Ion grid. We just add the following property. Ion grid padding is 0. And there we go, so now it has no padding at all. We can see that the grid takes up the entire width of the screen now. To make our example a little bit more spicy, I've just dragged in my icon to the assets folder, and then back inside the HTML I've just replaced all of those divs with just an image tag, and then it's referencing that same icon inside of my assets folder. Okay, so now things are getting a little bit more spicy. We can see that the icon takes up 100% of the column's width and height, and we can also see that the image tries to maintain its aspect ratio, and so since these top two columns are wider, they take up more height as well. If we want to mess with the individual padding for these columns right here, then we can just go inside the SCSS file and add in this Ion grid column padding attribute. And by the way, when you see any of these double dashes, these are special SCSS variables from Ionic. So there are only a certain amount of these, and this is one of them. So we can set the column padding to 0 as well, and now we should see no padding at all. Looks like there's still padding between the rows because for some reason the Ion columns width and height are not square like the images are. So the image is 447 by 447, but the Ion column is 447 by 451. So you could do some manual styling if you wanted to fix that. I'm just going to leave it like this. Now up to this point the grid has been 100% width of the parent, but we can fix that actually by adding this fixed attribute like so. And that will just make the grid take up a fixed amount of width within the screen size, and that scales depending on the actual screen size. So for mobile it still looks fine. And then we can increase the size of the screen and see that it adjusts the padding on the size. And if you're wondering like what makes this magic value, this 1140 width, well, that's just defined over here. It's the XL size in the docs for the grid size for fixed width. You can change these by using this SCSS property. So for instance, in our grid we could set our width for the XL to be like 360 px, and then now our grid will shrink. So even though it's the XL size, we've configured the XL size to be small like that. So you can configure any of those widths, or by default they just have certain values which Ionic has deemed appropriate for the given screen size. I'm just going to go ahead and take this off because I like the defaults and I think that looks a lot better. Also, something that I haven't mentioned about the grid, which is quite fundamental to how it works, is that the width of the grid takes up 12 units, and you can manually configure how many units each column takes up instead of having it auto resize them. So for instance, on the first column, I could have the first column take up a size of like 4 columns, and then that means that the second column will take up the remainder of those columns, which is 8 columns because 8 plus 4 is 12. So we can see that this small one right here takes up 4/12 of the width of the grid, and then this big one over here takes up 8/12 of the width of the grid. And the image tries to stay square. You could make it stretch if you wanted to. I'm not going to. I'll show you another example of size. In the bottom, I'm going to set the size of the outer ones to be size 1, like this, and then that means that the center one will have a size of 10, so it's going to be ginormous. Yep, so we see these are size 1, 1/12 of the width of the grid, and then this center one is 10/12 of the width of the grid. I'm going to make another example of a grid here with icons instead, and it's going to be using an ng for loop. So this is probably a super common use case for a lot of you guys, where the things in the grid aren't necessarily all predefined. You just want to iterate over some collection, maybe something from a server, or maybe you just want a quick array of writing your Ion grid, because for loops are super quick. So here I have 2 rows, and each row has a bunch of columns in it. Specifically, I'm going to iterate over all of the icons in the icons1 array, which I'm going to define in a second. And then inside each column there's going to be an icon with that icon name. And then the same exact thing in a separate row, but using the icons2 array. Okay, and then using ionicons.com, I'm just going to go and browse and get a bunch of random icons so that we can use them in our grid. So there are my icons. I've picked out 4 for the top row and 3 for the bottom row. And I'm also going to add a lot of spacing between the 2 grids to just kind of allow us to see them more in isolation. And there we go. There's the top grid taking up 100% of the parent. The top row has 4 columns. We got plus, star, magnet, and lock. Bottom one has keypad, mic, and the paper plane. If we wanted to center the icons inside of the columns, we could just go inside of the SCSS and add this text align center property under the ion column selector. And now the icons are all centered, so that's pretty cool. If we want to style one grid and not the other, for instance, say we want to add a bunch of padding to this top grid, then we need to add a class to the grid which we'd like to style. So we'll call this one grid of icons, and then in the SCSS we'll select for the class grid of icons using the dot syntax because it's a class. And here we can override the ion grid column padding, and it's important to note that this ion grid SCSS right here, this is still going to be applied to both grids, but this second one, since it comes after, it's just going to override it, and I'm going to override it with like 32px. And now in the top one we can see that the columns have padding of 32px, and in the bottom one the padding is still 0. Let's do another grid example of something called auto size, and you'll see what I mean in a second, but basically we just put this size equals auto on different columns, and what that will do is actually change the width of the column based on the size of the content. So the size of this column in the center here is exactly the size of its text content. Then let's say that I add a whole bunch of characters to the column right here, then it's going to try and take up even more width. So you can see it's taking up almost the entire width right now. So that's useful if you need your grid to scale with the size of its contents. I'm going to add another example up here of just a basic grid with some different sizes to illustrate another cool property of the ion grid. And that property is called push and pull. So notice here we have 1 of 3, 2 of 3, and 3 of 3. Well, we can actually reposition these elements by using properties instead of just reordering them. And we can do this using the push property. So if I push the first one the size of the second one, and I pull the second one the size of the first one, that will basically just make them switch places. So reloading, we can see that now the second one, still with its large width, is first, and the first one is now second, still with its small width. So basically these push and pull properties will reorder columns based on this push unit, which again is just a number on the scale of 12, which is the number of columns by default, which by the way, you can actually change the number of columns. So by default, it's going to be 12 like this, but we can actually change it to be something else. Like we could change it to be like 30. And now all those numbers which we were manually specifying in this topmost grid, they're on a scale of 30. So the one that says 1 of 3, that's only a size 2, which is now 2 out of 30. It's 2/30ths of the size of the entire width of the grid, which is still 100% of the width of its parent right now because we didn't set size fixed like we did for this one down here. And notice how down here these little ones got even littler, and that's because of the same thing. Down here for the JamieBot PNG grid, we still have a size of 1 for the bottom row, so this little guy is going to be 1/30th of the size of the grid. And then the big one in the center got even bigger because its size was not set, so the size is auto. So basically it's going to be 30 minus 2, which is 28, so it's going to be 28/30ths of the size of the grid, which again is still fixed because we have this fixed property right here. And so it's not taking up 100% of the width of the parent like these top 3 grids are. Alright guys, that wraps it up for the Ion grid. Definitely leave a comment below. I love hearing your guys' thoughts on what you thought of the video. If you have any issues or questions or you just want to talk, just leave it in the comments below and I'll get back to you. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy videos like this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.